Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics that write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, a serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs. Today, we welcome Jeff Kavanaugh, author of The Live Enterprise, Create Continuously Evolving and Learning Organizations, who is with Infosystems, right? Infosystems?
Infosys is good enough.
Infosys is good enough. So Jeff, please tell us about your background.
Well, began as an Indiana farm boy, as they say. Grew up in Indiana, as I was talking about earlier. And after getting the engineering undergrad, went down to Texas, did some interesting work on Star Wars programs, the old kind of defense electronics world. Learned a lot about where tech was headed. Worked with some very smart people, lots of patents, and is really an innovation-rich environment. And he started solving problems, especially as the defense industry slowed down a lot, post-Cold War, really had the urge to get out and work with clients or other companies. And so got in the consulting business, and for many years worked with mostly manufacturing and high-tech companies all over the world, and saw a lot of what worked, in some cases didn't work, and helped them grow. And got to work with the John Chambers of the world and some of these other leaders that well, you see what's going on the outside. When you see from the inside what it takes to make that happen, you get an appreciation of how difficult that is. I've been with Infosys about 16 years, and over that course gradually moved from consulting into this role where I am today. That it's called the Knowledge Institute, where we create and pull together all the knowledge from across the 250,000 employees and the 1,400 large clients and a lot of what's going on in the marketplace. And to be honest, I'd almost do it for free. It's a publishing and research house. We get to interview and analyze data and write and basically pull the body knowledge forward. Some cases it highlights something we've done, but often it's just pulling the best of the market. And so the Knowledge Institute has been a great platform for the last 2.5 years. I think we're really finding our way now, or hitting that point of scale after several hundred of assets, reports, got our first full-length book out, and then a lot of videos and things like that as well with leaders. A lot of personal things as well. Love tennis, and it's been great. We sponsor the ATP and French Open and the Australian Open. So we do a lot with analytics for tennis, and that's been great.
So I won free tickets for that because I've gone to the US Open. My girlfriend and I went in January of 2020 to the Australian Open just before everything shut down. So I haven't seen the French yet. And so I'm all open to you opening that door for some free tickets to that tournament. I'm wondering, why did you write this book?
Well, first of all, we needed to evolve to this point. So there needed to be something beyond a report. And as I was looking around at the possible things we could do, it became aware of our own journey. Infosys, if you look at the numbers, has kicked butt for a lot of years. High margins, good growth, one of the top sustainability companies, gone carbon neutral last year, which is a whole other topic I'm very proud of. But yet you think, well, it's basically a tech company. And over time, if I can use this phrase, asymptotically was kind of getting diminishing returns, for a global distribution of tech services and a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And so about 4 years ago, some painful decisions were made about reorganizing, not getting rid of people as much as don't do this, do this. We got to get more into AI, probably 2 or 3 years before a lot of other companies really made the bets. Long story short is when I started thinking about this book, I was noticing all the great things that were starting to bubble up, the results of all of our work. And we've gone through that journey. And then it also was during the time of COVID. And instead of it being a wall that we hit, it was a challenge that, 200,000 people, we were able to move from office to remote working in a week and didn't miss a beat. And then I noticed when we had this discussion with clients saying, you know what, keep your contracts, we got your back, because here's what we've done. They not only said, that's good, they said, by the way, we'd like to do that. And so we just saw that maybe what we had done was worth sharing. And with my consultant hat on in the past, said, rather than just have a collection of stories or say this was a great case study, let's dig into this like an operating model. So somebody else could use it, and use this broader question of how can large, but any established company compete with the digital natives or the stars, the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons. What's different? And how can you take that? And so we went deep and organized it. And that's how the book emerged, and that's how it's structured.
So how do you define the live enterprise?
If you look at classic business literature, the Dr. Michael Porters of the world and five forces and all that, you get kind of a sense that you do a thing, and then down the road you change that thing. You set up your strategy, you set up your operations, your plans. These are static things that periodically you make these big decisions and change. Well, anyone that's been around a while, and you and I spoke earlier, we've both been here longer than we'll admit. Yep. We noticed that the rate of change in the market, if you're a customer for whatever that you're doing, is faster than the rate of change in your company to catch up. And if you can nod your head and say, oh yeah, our projects always take longer. By the time we're done, the problem you're solving, it's already moved on. If you think about though, that's a pretty depressing thing, that everything you do in your company, you'll always be behind. You'll always be catching up. So we thought, well, what if you design your company, you design all the systems and processes and even your talent to evolve and to do it fast enough. I mean, that has to be a guiding principle at the beginning. That is what a live enterprise is. And if you want to summarize it, you've got all these small teams. So think about 1,000 Silicon Valley garages or small teams that they're innovating, they're working with customers or an internal process, whatever it is. And yet you also have this shared digital infrastructure, platforms that are centrally managed and that people can plug into. So one, you don't have to create all this overhead. It's kind of like if you wanted to create a blog, you could tap into WordPress, right? You don't have to create your own thing. You tap into a platform. Well, in a company, having that shared digital infrastructure. So the idea is you can begin something. You can also, if it's a good idea, it's a venture capital model, all these little ideas, you curate them and you fund them and you scale them quickly. So here's the thing. Most companies can either be at scale or they can have lots of little teams running around. To do both simultaneously and to be able to evolve and continuously learn, that's hard. In fact, it's, no one's done that really. And that's the thing that we evolve to. That's what a live enterprise is.
So this brings me to my next question, which I thought was interesting. By the way, the book is great. And it's one of those things you got to read a couple of times, and still it's going to take more than that because there's so much information in there. I mean, you were really well researched this topic about how to make changes.
Can I add one thing there? Because it is a business book, but one of the things, and I think we're all kind of a combination of right brain, left brain, or art and science, systems and nature. We said, could we look to nature for cues here? Because we noticed some things going on that beyond or just underneath the surface of nature, which looks simple and elegant, there's a lot of complexity.
Yes.
Like even the fact that in a trees, there's a wood wide web where all these trees are connected and they're actually sending nutrients back and forth and signaling. Now it might be an inch an hour, but they literally are moving around in this connected, and this fungus actually does that. There's several of these examples. We decided that each chapter, each concept that supported the model, we would really dig into one of those. Like the ultraviolet coating on leaves that guides a bee, because one of the 3 colors they see is ultraviolet, actually guides them in. Well, what kind of similarity could we use to pull into the shared digital infrastructure? The point is that at the beginning of each chapter, actually, you could be reading National Geographic. And then we make that transition, and hopefully that also brings out not just something that's accurate, like a business book, but something that's actually very interesting. In fact, if you talk to Dr. Unrek Sala, who has a wonderful book about the nature of nature, and he's the head explorer for National Geographic. I mean, he's the one that plunges and goes beneath the glaciers, or he's the one saving the oceans, literally. Fantastic individual. We worked with people like that. And so we were able to weave in lessons from nature, as well as the sustainability piece, which we culminate in this thing we call the triple helix, like the stakeholder capitalism and the environmental piece. But I want to highlight that as well, that we wanted to make sure this thread of the natural world with the digital also came through.
Yeah, and it did. Probably a lot of my questions are going to be probably more on the practical side of what I read from your book. So you refer to the traditional operating model as being dated. Please describe what you consider the traditional operating model, and what model should companies develop now, because it appears the improved model has a lot of elements to consider when you look in your book and you have those charts about all the things that have to be in these newer models. So tell us about that.
Well, traditionally, an operating model has at its core the value delivery. It's the thing you do. Either it's the service, the product, and you have everything around it organized to support it. And being in consulting for a lot of years, I had the pleasure or pain of seeing lots of them and talking with lots of people. And most of them, first of all, weren't actually thoroughly thought through. They were just boxes on a page. The actual connections and layers, it wasn't as rigorous as it was, let's say, for tech architecture. And they were a little too static, to be honest. They were containers where you put things. They didn't actually govern and show the flow. There'd be a process library, and there'd be roles and responsibilities and metrics and maybe some governance. But essentially, it was just almost like folders where you put your documents, and the executive had to put them together. The difference is it needs to be very fluid. So can you have this group of companies, or I'm sorry, teams, micro enterprises we're calling them, and this shared digital infrastructure, and then you're connecting them via what we're calling a knowledge graph. Facebook has a social graph. LinkedIn has like a worker or employee graph. The idea is everything that's going on is captured and it's connected. And so you're constantly getting the inputs. And then the digital brain, which is both the deterministic kind of rules-based, and then as you get to more of the AI related, what you're doing with it. So it's a sense, analyze, respond. And I think that's the difference, is you're taking the hard steps to actually bring that operating model to life and make it more fluid. And then against that backdrop, your people, you're providing a mechanism they can learn, not just these large blocks of just in case learning, but these micro just in time from your platform, from whatever it is, even right before you actually perform a task, getting a little bit of training or knowledge so you can do that effectively. That's the biggest difference, is the fluidity and the constant evolving.
So you write in the opening of the book about how the pandemic has changed business. And I got to believe, just based on what you've just said so far, that you have seen enormous change in just roughly 14 months since the pandemic started. So how has the pandemic affected large enterprises and business in general? And what do you think we've learned from this?
Well, for anyone that's been following business closely, forgive if I say things you already know, but I think we need to say it. It didn't necessarily or just change business. It accelerated some things that were going on. So it accelerated the issues in retail. It accelerated the comfort about having certain meetings, let's say remotely, or the kind of work that you could do when you weren't in the same room. And by the way, if you could be across town, then maybe you could do the same thing across the country, across the world. So in effect, the pendulum for globalization just swung back a bit. The other thing that we noticed, so there's accelerating trends that would have taken years to comfortably get to very quickly, because now you had the less risk, you had the burning platform, you had to do it. Second, it highlighted the importance of cloud, cybersecurity, some of these trends that now are just so intrinsic that companies aren't even asking necessarily, should this be in my budget? It's how much can I afford to put in? I have to put everything I can, because you've got to move your workloads, your cloud, and all these things enable everything else. The other thing that I think it shifted is, we've talked about being customer centric for a long time. And it's kind of one of those, you nod your head, it's an article of faith. Employees have gotten second shrift at many companies. Our systems were the ones that had the green screen, the clunky things that wouldn't work. And yeah, if you were in a customer facing capacity, maybe you got some good things. What the pandemic did is, one, it highlighted the importance of your employee, from compliance and that you don't break laws to your wellness, your mental health, your safety, many different aspects. And then of course, arming and equipping the employees to be effective. Because if they are your most important asset, then you ought to feed them. You ought to nurture them. I think those are two things. And then this idea of resilience or insurance, because the classic just-in-time model is wonderful. It's efficient if all goes well. But it can also be kind of brittle because, like the automotive, every 4 hours, those parts showing up at the OEM's final assembly. What happens when that truck doesn't show up for a day?
Yeah.
What happens when those chips don't show up, as we're finding now? So I think, kind of like in your own life, you buy insurance for things that you hope don't happen. And you also have plan B. And I think people are realizing maybe I can take a little off the top of my operating margin and plow it back to resilience. So not just the black swans, maybe all the striped ones and the other ones that will happen more often, that I'm ready for them. And I think the market not only is okay with that, they're going to say, wait a minute, what is your resilience plan? What is your risk plan? So risk, I think, has come again to be a very popular topic. So I think those are the three big things that we're seeing.
I had John Chambers on almost exactly a year ago talking about his book, and I had Tim Draper on like maybe the week after that. And I thought it was interesting that everybody thought the economy was going to take this enormous hit. The stock market was going to fall like it fell in 2008. And yet that's not what happened. It took a small bump in the road, but I think because of all the things that you said, that companies like yours help other companies adjust quickly. And so aside from the businesses where you had to actually show up in person, like a restaurant or something along those lines, everything else kind of kept going forward with this. And when we saw how quick the drug was developed, 9 months instead of a decade, that was pretty impressive.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we were veering a little bit. I think there are a couple of points to make there. One of them is there is some unevenness. Some industries, because of the nature of the product, their work, or their service, did really well, and some of them didn't. Obviously, the cruise lines and things like that.
Yeah.
I also think the small business versus Amazon is a good example. Amazon became not only convenient, it just not in a non-linear way really benefited from it, and many small businesses didn't, because there were different characteristics. I do think that the printing of money, or the huge stimulus, that also papered over some other things. So I think some of these aftershocks will show up, in the months or years to come. But I think for the most part, you pretty much hit it. I think the acceleration is the key word. Companies that were doing things that were conducive did them faster and better. And the ones that didn't, I think, hit a major hiccup, or they switched. But I do think we're going to see maybe like the other shoe dropping, in some number of months, where I think the aftershocks will affect some companies that, at least to date, have had some, of a lifeline given to them.
Oh, no question about it. What is the quantum organization?
Well, if you think about the operating model, well, one aspect of the company and all of its things has to be the organization itself, how it's structured. And we were thinking about how do you view this? Is it an org chart? Is it a list of people or skills? We came up with quantum organization because, like in quantum physics, it's multi-state. And we thought that quantum, besides sounding really cool, captures this notion that you've got to do multiple things simultaneously. That's a different concept. So one aspect is you're driving your car. There's the CarPlay or whatever that's capturing your entertainment, your communication. It knows who you are. Well, if you leave the car and go to your home, does the home know where you are? Does your computer know? So this idea of following you around in multiple ways, organizing around you. Same thing in a company. Is it aware of the multiple states that you're in your company? The other is, with all these activities going on, There's different dimensions of them. So we thought that this idea of a multi-state, being able to look at a situation from multiple perspectives, and also be able to be organized in a very fluid way. If you notice in that chapter, we talk about the product-based organization.
Mm-hmm.
And those of you that are kind of agile savvy know that the movement in from projects to product-based organizations for software development. Well, in the last few years, especially for these more enlightened companies, that's left the IT world and gone to the business world. I mean, you got lawyers and HR folks doing sprints. They're literally having backlogs and burn down boards. And I was with some companies or helping them go through this process where these business folks were doing that. So the quantum organization is about embedding agile into the org chart and the way you do your work. That's it in a nutshell. And then the last piece is, if you think about business processes, well, it used to be you'd have a process map or something static, maybe even some simulation. Well, if you have digitized your business processes, like Mark Andreessen said, software's eating the world, well, then it's become software. And if you think about what DevOps is, that part of Agile, DevOps, it's a software element. So it's not really just software DevOps, it's business ops. So business operations are now kind of digital, more and more so. Because if you can measure it, if you've got rules, it can be digitized. And certainly robotic process automation is a big part of that. So the quantum organization also incorporates this idea there's a digital dimension as well as the human and physical dimension of work. And a lot of it's being absorbed into these automation packages or automation systems. And I think that duality of human and digital continues to go. So it isn't that your robot is your asset, like a machine, it's actually a teammate. And so the quantum organization is also thinking about those things simultaneously.
Business gurus always talk about the need for organizations to disrupt themselves. How do you define disruption, and how is InfoSystems doing that, and how do businesses recognize when it's even time to disrupt the current model? Because we've seen many companies go south, like Kodak and other Sears and other big names that didn't disrupt themselves and found themselves essentially out of business almost.
The first thing is, and again, the whole notion of a knowledge graph is be sensing, know where the market's going, know what's demanded, and have those, as Jim Collins would say, confront the brutal facts. You know, are you on track? Does a big change, is it needed? And if that's the case, I think making sure that your underlying foundation is fluid. It's designed to evolve. Even your architecture, in the systems that are involved, that you don't have once every 3 or 5 years some massive project that takes 3 or 5 years to then change. So I think architecting from the ground up is important. The disruption also might require a hard discussion that says, you know, it would take years to maybe go into these old systems. Maybe we can put a wrapper around them, like a lot of folks. In fact, we had many really good internal systems at Infosys. We thought, you know, we could go recode and do everything for them and redo them, or have a fantastic or mobile app that reaches in, pulls everything out, and has a nice face to it. We did that. And so 100 apps became 3 or 4, you know, one for recruiting and one for the employees, and then one for people that were more client facing. And it saved a lot of time. We were able to disrupt what we did without having to do a lot of technology change in the background, you know, immediately. But I think the disruption also can be a false dichotomy or ultimatum. There are certain things that you're doing pretty well. You can make incremental improvements. No reason to tear them apart. Make your 1% improvements every month. There are other areas that can have exponential. We call it process busting. You know, deconstruct it, find the good components, put it together, different parts of the world, different applications, use what's relevant. But I think having that duality where you disrupt elements of your business that need to be, but keep in place, because you can't have too many variables simultaneously. You can't change everything at once. You've got no footing. I think those are the hard decisions to make. What do you prioritize first? We chose a lot of our employee facing things first because that gave us that foundation. And with 250,000 employees, as important as our customers and clients were, it gave us that flexibility. So I think making those choices on how you prioritize is as important, because you can't just say, I don't want to be like Kodak, for example, that story, and change everything, because then nobody has a sense of continuity. And that's the other thing that we might be talking about. This idea of big changes, well, they come from very small incremental changes. We have a concept called micro is the new mega. We looked at a lot of behavioral psychology, things like atomic habits and nudge theory and things like that. And if someone has a very small change, you can do that and you can make it permanent, and another and another and another. And pretty soon that's a pretty big change. And by aligning those micro changes with whatever you're doing with business change, your agile cycles and all that, you have things that stick. So change management is irreversible. It actually sticks. And it's lower risk, because let's say you're making these small changes, very small behavioral changes. Well, the problem you're solving might be different in a month or two, but you can't say, nope, requirements are locked in, I can't touch it for the next year and a half. In fact, we were fortunate, if people are interested, they can just look out there. Harvard Business Review published something on this topic that we wrote, Rafi and I, earlier this month. So it's very timely as well.
You're talking about my favorite magazine. I read that like the people read the Bible.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to seeing that piece. How hard is it to change an organization? I mean, in the book, it said you had 240,000. So you already, increased by about 5% the number of people working there. So located, especially when people around the world, different cultures, all those things, how did you guys manage to do it successfully?
Well, I think there's two or three aspects. One of them is, I'd like to say, maybe you can't always replicate this. Nandan Nilekani is our chairman, founder. He was one of the first 7 or 8 people in the entire company way back when. And he left when he got to a certain point, did some things like cabinet level roles with Indian government, and then came back. And to be honest, that was a catalyst, because there's something about, from the very top, somebody who's not only has a vision, but they're rolling up their sleeves. I mentioned this micro change. Every 6 weeks, the chairman and founder has a 2-hour session that some people on my team are on, that with people making these changes. Every 6 weeks, something in the company is changing, and he's getting a view and making sure it happens. So I think that's one element. Somebody very senior and respected, that everyone else knows it's important. Second is, although there was some churn maybe 3 or 4 years ago, the senior leadership is pretty consistent. We have a phrase in basketball called the no look pass, where you've played together enough, you kind of know each other. And I think that's been key too, because imagine a lot of senior executives who have worked together for a long time. If you have that trust, if you have that knowledge, you can be in this pandemic, you can be all disconnected, but still kind of know what each other is doing and trust motives. So you can make big decisions pretty quickly. If nobody knows each other, if they've all been thrown together in the last year, there's a lot of protection going on, or caution, that maybe you make incremental decisions because you're not quite sure, you're testing. Or in this case, someone knew what the other person had done for the last 4 years, or 5 or 10 in some cases, like Ravi Kumar, our president. I've worked with him for 12 years. So, I think that also helps. And if you have those things in place, I think you can be more bold. And if you don't, then maybe you have to show success from a pilot. But regardless, I think that those two things help a lot.
So here's a question from the audience. Can you talk a bit more about how you help companies choose what they change and what they don't? In my experience, as you said, can be really hard. Lots of demand, little capacity.
And part of it's prioritizing. And I think part of it too is being pretty ruthless on, what do you stop doing? I think we all have this idea of adding more. You know what? It's a good idea. I'll do it. I'll do it. I'll do it. And then what happens is there's a bit of a mediocrity that creeps in, because you just can't give everything attention. So I think, and then it goes back to strategy 101, what do you say no to? Saying no to a lot of things. I think also understanding the relationships. If you do one thing, does it enable you to do something else? The other is being bold and backing up with data. Still in this day of analytics and data everywhere, I think it's getting better, but a lot of decisions are still made without solid logical support. I'm a big fan of the pyramid principle and being able to organize thinking. When you have structured logic, you've got data backing it up, and you present it in a compelling way, the visualization, I think then people can get behind it. I think too often people either try force of personality or the data's buried. It's kind of like, unfortunately, the Challenger situation years ago where the data was there, but it wasn't presented right and people couldn't make the decision, even though it was kind of staring at them. I think those are the biggest areas. The other is technology has made such a leap forward that if you can take a look and say, what can technology do for us? Like I do a podcast periodically as well. And yesterday, someone who's head of science for an AI company that does a lot with the government, these intelligence agencies, and making sense of it all. And they were saying that just capturing the data and making it easier to work through, giving people confidence. It's amazing what can happen once you do that. And there was, in fact, in natural language processing, that's the example I was looking for. They've done it for years, but 2 years ago, a breakthrough happened where these models could be generated through code. And so all of a sudden, 90% of your time was spent being creative instead of 10%. Technology every few months is bubbling up with these things. So I think using technology to its fullest is also important, because these are non-linear levers that we have. I think it's important that we make use of them.
So when you study competitors, and you talk about this in the book, what should someone look for that could help their own organization improve?
I think there's an inward out and an outward in. I mean, obviously we're in a world where there's lots of information you can get. They're good practices. Don't want to say best practices, because the moment you say it's the best one, someone else knows.
Yeah.
So it's a good or leading practice. I think we should be very diligent and proactive about that. I think the other is look at what you have. Is it fit for purpose? Is your market changing? I was doing something earlier today with one of the folks on my team, and about the blurring and the blending of industries. In this case, it was manufacturing. How not only are your competitors changing, because Amazon seems to compete with everyone, and so does Google, because data and monetization, it's an opportunity for you as a company, and yet it's also a threat because companies that are good at that. So I think the biggest thing is, first of all, get connected. Make sure that everything you have is connected, because once you connect it, then you can observe it. And once you observe it, you can analyze it. Once you can analyze it, then you can develop insights, observe patterns. So don't jump to strategy. Because you can get bottoms up on the data. Just connect it. And you've got the data. And right now, one of the dividends of the smartphone wars has been these sensors and IoT have just plummeted in price. These endpoints can continue to give information to you in whatever business you're in. And your employees, your customers, you have a unique sense of information, data coming at you, that if you make sense of it, your decision will be much more informed. I think people overlook that because it's mundane, but at the same time, it's very powerful. And once the insights start to come, then you refine, and you essentially have built your own models. I think the word model is also a misunderstood one. Everyone needs a model, whether it's a framework, whether it's an actual architectural model. And as you get data and you start understanding relationships, then you can make bold decisions because you've got the confidence behind them.
How do you recruit the right people in a mammoth organization to accept that change? Because people who are attracted to large organizations rarely embrace change, unlike people like me who are attracted to early stage and startups and like all of that. But once you get to being a big organization, everybody wants to have rules, and they don't like a lot of change, hence why they're attracted to it. Stability.
I think it's a traditional view. I'll take just to maybe a little bit of a deflection on that, or a
Sure.
bit of a turn. I think today, first of all, bifurcate that. You've got experienced hires and you have people coming from campus. I think, I'm dating myself or aging myself, but daughters are old enough that they've been through that cycle, and they'll say, all right, Dad, my generation, or my group, or here's what the deal is. And what they're finding, I think, especially those that came of age or grew up during the Great Recession, they actually do want some stability. They want the purpose, they want all the cool stuff,
Right.
but they also want some stability. And I think if they can find a company that does allow them to have a good, their purpose, as well as some level of stability, and they get to do cool things and they get to learn a lot. I think that's the mix they're looking for. Certainly, we've already hired 13,000 people in the US in the past, year or two. We've committed to 12,000 more. So we're keenly interested in what traditional engineering, liberal arts, and now we're even reaching into community colleges. So we're thinking really hard about the numbers and also the different groups. How can we pull in a diverse group, different ways of thinking, in some cases degree programs, in some cases credentials. Same thing in Europe, same thing in Australia. We have a pretty good engine in India from the old days, but from history. But I think that's one of the things that we're seeing is they do want that combination. And even the experienced folks, I think they want a sense of freshness. They know they have to reinvent themselves. And so if they're at a company where the only friction, the only thing holding someone back from learning and training is their own motivation, then that's also an essential part of the live enterprise model. In fact, we focused on this learning management system, this platform, because we had this massive 200-acre campus in Mysore, India, where 20,000 people at a time would be trained, and it was great, but we couldn't all get there. So how can we stuff that in your mobile device or your laptop? Anytime, anywhere, any device, any person. And then we found that once we did that, within a year, I think 65% of our population across the board was spending more than 35 minutes a day training because they had access to it in bite-sized amounts. And so part of it was top-down, part of it, though, was democratizing it. And so whether you do it yourself or you partner with a Coursera or Udacity or some other organization, that has to be there, because as important as compensation is and some other things, people are thirsty and they're going to get it somewhere. If they can get it from you as a company, that's one more value proposition element that you have for them.
Yeah, I don't think money is the pure motivator here. I think if they feel like that they can make an impact and what they're doing is important, then they'll stick with it. And especially our kids, because you and I have the kids the same age. My daughter keeps saying, I don't want your life. I want more work-life balance. And when she's looking at organizations, she's being recruited now by one of the top consulting firms in the world. And that was her first question, was about work-life balance. So I think part of that is being put into play here in a significant way by our daughters and following generations. Could you please talk about the project and concept of Indian Stack and how you used what was learned there to improve your company?
Sure. Well, like I said, Nandan Nilekani, who, for those of you that don't know, is kind of like a Henry Ford and Bill Gates kind of rolled into one for what happened, grew an industry, especially the early days. But we actually went beyond the company, though. Maybe it's because the roots were in India, but thinking about sustainability from day one, scarce resources, lifting up the community, a lot of social programs. Anyway, at some point, I think it was 2008, correct me if I'm wrong, he stepped back. Somebody else became CEO, and he actually joined the Indian government or in a cabinet level position because they just didn't have an equivalent of social security numbers, for example, or universal ID. So they had this thing called the Aadhaar, AADHAAR initiative, a unique ID. And so everybody had a digital ID. If you think about it, how do you do that across 1 billion plus people? And how do you do it where there's no fraud? And so very quickly, he, with a few other individuals, they using open source, using these micro change concepts, were able to pull together something, had biometric, so fingerprint, retinal. They were able to connect. People could get government payments. They could open checking accounts. I mean, it allowed them to exist because hundreds of millions of people just didn't exist on the grid. And it was just phenomenal. And I think over 1 billion people in 6 years became part of this thing. 1 billion. In the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, some of the economists said this should have taken 46 years. And they did it in 6. And it's just so many good things that happened. And it was done in so inexpensively, and it was so fluid. He was thinking, why can't we do that maybe in a enterprise, in a corporate setting? Before he left, he said, the ID was part of it. There's a payment system. Basically, all these other things that form our financial systems, they put in place. So the stack is a whole series of these applications that have allowed their financial systems to be more robust, resilient, more inclusive, and essentially catch up to things we take for granted in other parts of the world. So that's what the India stack is. And so it's more of these government services that are digital, as well as connecting to the financial. And what he did was say, if this worked at this scale, how do we apply it to enterprise? And then before he tried applying it to a lot of companies, he said, let's do it at Infosys first. Let's make sure we prove that this hypothesis can work. And so that was the challenge he gave to the chief architect of the company, Rafi Tarafdar. And as we worked on this, a lot of learnings, and then the live enterprise is what emerged from it.
One of the things I thought was interesting in your book is you write about Adam Smith's invisible brain. What is that, and how was that incorporated into your company's planning?
Well, it was, if the Industrial Revolution, it was the Adam Smith's invisible hand, we're saying the digital will be the invisible brain. In other words, that pervasive brain that sits and works with the knowledge graph. So you have this in your own life. It might all be in your head, but the idea is, can you digitize it? Can you pull these things together as a company and then act upon it? And it's the ability to not only connect everything, observe it, analyze it, make a decision, and have this feedback loop. And every time you do a little more of it, you automate, you're applying AI, and you're freeing up humans. It's kind of like putting an Iron Man suit on. You can see farther, be more powerful, do more things. And the more of the white space you pull out, the more of the overhead, the delays, the cost to get the same thing or more done, then we're taking full advantage. Because even analysts today, so much of the time is spent pushing paper or moving files around, saving them, knowing you did this over here, you put it over there, you let somebody know. What happens when all that's pulled together? And yes, the privacy and all kinds of other issues pop up along the way. That's essentially what it is. And then when there's that trust, this is where the blockchains of the world come in, between parties, then supply chains can function. Money can flow across borders. You can trust the source of a product, that it was sourced the right way. You can have circular supply chains. You can monitor true carbon footprints. All kinds of things happen. And that's why we say the digital brain, as well as that knowledge graph, is the key to the future.
So now that you mentioned about money as well, what do you think of cyber currency? I mean, where is that going to fit in here?
To be honest, that's an area that I'm not an expert. I think there's two aspects. One is based upon verification and trust. It allows, like, I keep going back to blockchain. I keep going back to this.
Right.
This
That's what made me ask that question.
Source.
Sure.
Yeah. So in that respect, it's great. And so the question is, does it veer more towards governments adopting it? So it's kind of like a quasi, or is there truly something that floats outside? Because when it starts floating outside of any regulation, then it becomes interesting, because then you're actually tugging at the social fabric or established norms on how governments and societies interact. I think that there will be oscillation. I think what's going on now is good. In fact, I have a picture on my smartphone the other day. I was at this convenience store, the 7-Eleven, and noticed there's two ATM machines. There was the ATM machine, and the Bitcoin ATM machine, the Bitcoin
No kidding.
machine. Yes, yes. And it said one, Bitcoin equals $61,920. I said, this is very interesting.
I never saw that before.
Yeah, it's just, and again, in a suburb of the Dallas area. And so I think it's starting to permeate. I think what has to happen, unfortunately, is the froth will come off and people will start to understand what the real value is. I mean, if you think about what value of money is, it's a store of value, it's a medium of exchange, and there's a trust element to it. And the store of value piece, well, why is it valuable? Well, maybe there's a limited amount out there. Is it truly a medium of exchange? And then the other piece, of course, is the trust and acceptance. The more digital it gets, the more cash goes away, the more we don't use government backed, then we get to this more international global thing, and that's a whole other dimension. Who is that global authority, and do they have too much power, or is it truly like the web, where it's the Wild West, and there's no one really in charge except for some standards? And those are open questions. I don't have answers to those, but those are the things I'm looking at.
Yeah, it's beyond my comprehension, I have to say, because I keep reading, and I've had lots of people on this show talk about it. And, on cyber currency, I just don't really get it because it's still backed by dollars. And the only good thing I see out of it is if you're running clandestine operations, you want anybody to trail your money. That makes perfect sense to me.
And then whenever you have something that goes up by more than 50%, you have to ask yourself, does this look or smell like a nice Dutch tulip?
Yeah.
In other words, is it just people frothing? And then the moment people back away from that froth, does it settle back to something that's below the floor right now?
Yeah.
Or is it that natural evolution where it's still going to be double or triple? It's kind of like any industry. There's this exuberance, and then there's a reality, and you find a floor where there's real value. But I'm not sure we really know where that solid base is yet.
Well, I didn't listen to Tim Draper, and I told him I was still confused about it when he was saying it at $200 a Bitcoin. He said it'll be over 20,000. It did. I don't think he envisioned 60,000 for a Bitcoin, but I kind of think it's almost like gambling. That's when I look at it now. It's a crazy stock that doesn't make any sense.
But again, but the last thing I'll say on this is, if you look at blockchain, if you look at the idea of trust in a world where you can literally fake videos and things we thought were easy to, then the idea of trust becomes more and more important in the future. And so if these cryptocurrencies help with the trust, they will take off. If there's questions, they won't.
Somebody's going to game the system. They always do. It doesn't matter what it is. Somebody will eventually game it. And, everything that was created was meant for good things. And then somehow people corrupted it for bad. And we've seen that over the history of man. How does the live enterprise increase the velocity of new ideas and innovations, especially as big an organization as yours, as even small organizations have a hard time doing that? How does yours enterprise do that, where somebody comes up with an idea and can move it quickly through the system to where you're going to say yes or no, and then execute?
Again, going back to that duality of many, many small teams working. Yes, they have some org structure, but it's fairly permeable. I mean, yes, there are some roll-ups, like there's an industry sales team, or there's this service team, or the HR function, but there's a lot of fluidity. And as a need arises, let's say it's like a venture capital model, and you pull in the right people to accomplish that task. You have your day job, but you might pull in somebody on a part-time basis with expertise, like in legal. Like we just did this thing where we created a gig platform for the company because we saw the part-time work. It was difficult for contractors. We pulled in people from legal and HR, part-time basis, to figure it out. Well, you know what? Then there's a stage gate. So if you apply a venture capital VC model, then good ideas get funded better. Other ones get starved, they disband, and people focus on other things. I think that quick churn, or the evolution, that cadence, combined with this digital runway or this shared digital infrastructure, that gives you the scale to quickly grow. Because it isn't that you're going after fiefdoms like 40 teams all say they need millions of dollars so they can go pilot whatever they're doing. There's some shared infrastructure you can tap into, platforms to get things done. And things that do well, ideas that do well, become businesses, become functions, become organizations that have lasting power, lasting, tenure. Those that don't, it's not necessarily a mistake as much as that wasn't the opportunity we thought. We didn't go from seed to Series A to Series B to whatever. And I think if you apply that model, then you go, good ideas get funded. So the trick is, the challenge is, this quantum organization set it up so you can have a VC model. You can have this central group, this small central group of infrastructure or platforms that you can plug into. And it's the combination of those things. Dozens, hundreds, thousands of these across a company. That's kind of where we are with it. And it drives people that want hardcore org structures crazy,
Right.
but it also allows the fluidity. You don't have to have complete knowledge of what's going on. Somebody in Poland might understand what's working. And you know what? Go feed that. Something else, like the pandemic, it hit different countries in different ways. So this whole return to workplace or certain aspects of working, maybe it's manifests itself differently. That's okay. And where it is common, we get the economies of scale. And I think that balance, yeah, it's hard, but I think that's what's required going forward.
I think you said that your company has changed, like, and not every company has, where before all the decisions were centralized, but I think you said that it's kind of been moved out of being centralized, and folks in Poland or wherever are making decisions that are best for them, but still falling under the same mission as the company. Does that sound about right?
It is. I think that the one central area, I think there's still a really strong hold for finance, which you can say is good or bad, but definitely has kept us, good, profitability and resilience and be able to deploy capital. I think from almost every operational decision, certainly ones that relate to the market and the people, they are being pushed to the edge. I think there are some of the decisions, like I mentioned, the broader financial ones and some of the platform ones. There's still inputs are coming from everywhere, but there are some centralized ones because I think they're consistent enough and they affect enough. But more of the decisions are absolutely pressed to the edges.
You talk about leadership skills. Should companies be grooming their leaders in a different way now? I mean, how should leaders be groomed to run the companies going the next 10, 20 years?
The answer is yes. And I think if you go way back, leadership was command and control, and middle management was a lot of messaging. You took the strategic message, you pushed it down to your unit, and vice versa. You rolled it up. You were a connector. That has gone. The middle manager as a intermediary, it doesn't exist. I think a few years ago that happened, but certainly now, the leader needs to have a portfolio. Needs to be. It's almost like the professional services. I came from with consulting, or investment banking, or accounting, or law, or a doctor, where the more senior you get, you're still having clients. You need to become an expert, and you aren't just managing. You need to be a senior person in that domain where you are. So I think the idea that you are a producer, if you want to call it that, so you're leading through that as well as the people side. Another thing is embrace enthusiastically the notion of servant leadership. You've got to be in a service mode because, first of all, it's a different world than a few decades ago, or even a couple, where people expect that. Maybe they want more of the nurturing, whatever it is. So I think taking a servant leader approach, it's very other centric. And you make sure you know the problem, you empathize, your employee, your customer, the person you're working with. I think it's a combination of those three things: expertise at what you do, really have expertise, being able to be fact-based to enhance that, being able to think critically and be, have that stack of skills, and then be that servant leader, but not be eccentric or crazy, but but definitely be entrepreneurial and know that being safe really isn't safe anymore.
I think today's leaders realize that unlike when you and I were entering the workforce, where you didn't have as many choices of where to work, now, like you said before earlier, that you have to realize that your employees are customers too, and do everything you can to make the experience a good one for them, or they can work for somebody else and then not even near their own home across the world. And so now you're competing for the best and brightest. And if you don't treat them in a way that they feel they should be treated, they're out of there. They don't have to worry
and
about
ironically, even if you do have the better value proposition, you pay pretty well, you give the training, and you're generally pretty good. If you don't make sure that the employee understands that, in other words, you might be doing all the right things, but if they don't perceive you are, or for some reason you're not connecting, they might go to a worse situation. We've seen the whole grass is greener thing. Maybe it's gratification, maybe it's the expectations of all, keeping things fresh. So it isn't even just doing the right things. It's communicating in a way to make sure that you're confident that your employees do sense it and they are getting it. So I think the other aspect maybe I missed in your previous question is leaders need to be good communicators.
Yeah, that's why I was asking about all the different skill sets that they're going to need today, as opposed to, when we entered the workforce. I mean, it's so evolved now that those leaders wouldn't even recognize the workforce today or how to operate a business.
That's right.
My last question is, what changes in education, possibly high school, but for sure college, do you think should be made as we're going forward here?
Do we have another hour for this one? In all seriousness,
seconds or less, right?
Yeah. In all seriousness, I think changes are underway. On the one hand, I'm troubled. On the other hand, very excited about where education's going. I do think at each stage, as students enter the next level, are they really prepared? Especially after this past year, are they prepared for the next level and the next one? So, for example, the expectation of an employer about what they get from a four-year graduate. I think there's a reason why companies like ours have added 8 to 12 to 16 weeks of training after they came on board to make sure they're quote unquote client or professional ready. At the same time, I'm excited about what like Indiana Ivy Tech in Indiana, 100,000 students at a community college level. They're pulling in first generation college students, single mothers, all kinds of different underserved groups that they're giving them this on-ramp, either 2 years of school or 4 years, very applicable vocational degrees, things that are very relevant, even other schools. And they're making it very practical, experiential. So I think that there needs to be a tight connection between the public and private, employers and the academics and the governments. And then in several states, this is manifesting itself. So I think it's positive. If politics cannot get in the way, I think there's some very well-intended, smart people who are doing the right things at a grassroots level. And I think these experiments are going on in multiple states in the US, multiple countries. And I think if at the national level, the best of those experiments can be coordinated, it's kind of like the best ideas, I think we'll be in good shape. I think the top-down approach misses some of the good things that are bubbling up. And I do think it's also important that the universities, the ones with the research and the longer term focus, they don't just run to things that are very short term, because we do need longer term thinking, whether it's medicine or there's some disciplines that it takes a long time. So I think there's a healthy mix of the things that are very rapidly evolving and the things that do take some time to build your base. That's what I see going forward.
Jeff, I have to tell you, it was a fast, great hour, and one of the few times I've ever seen where nobody left. There was not a single person who signed off during this time. So obviously, this was a great discussion. I hope people will get your book. You did a really great job. We look forward to staying in contact with you. I hope everybody has a great weekend. And thanks again for taking the time to speak with us.
And come join the Knowledge Institute, infosys.com/IKI. We have hundreds of things like this that support it. They're free. and hopefully it will help whoever comes to see.
If you email me this, I'll make sure it gets to everybody because I send them all the link to this interview.
Got it. Thanks for having me.
Have a great rest of your day and a great weekend. Take care, everyone.